All right, let's maybe kick her off. Ready, JB?
I am ready. Ready when you are.
Let's do this. All right, welcome everybody to Cybersecurity Predictions for 2021. I'm Derek Abdeen, and today we have guest speaker from Forrester, Joseph Blankenship, also known as JB. So without further ado, we can kind of get started on this little show.
All right, let's do it. And just for everyone's information, we'll do a Q&A at the end. And if you've got questions, please put those into the chat panel and we can answer them at the end. Or Derek, we may even get bold and try to answer some of these as we go, depending on what gets thrown in here.
Hello.
All right, and as Derek said, I'm Joseph Blankenship, Vice President and Research Director with Forrester. Really happy to be here speaking with you today and talking to you about our cybersecurity predictions for 2021. A little bit on my background in bio, but basically I'm an analyst and research director at Forrester covering security and risk, covering a lot of topics, mostly around security operations. And I also lead the team that covers things like zero trust and CISO leadership at Forrester. So some of what I'm going to do today is I'm going to cover a little bit on data breaches and trends, because would it really be a security presentation if we didn't talk about breaches and overall trends? Then we'll get into Forrester cybersecurity predictions for 2021. We do predictions every year at Forrester, and typically at the end of the year we will grade ourselves to see how we did. I'm not going to get into our 2020 grades. I think we've got that posted on the website and the blog if you're interested in that, and then we'll get into recommendations. Then I'm going to hand it off to Derek for him to walk us through the end of this. But one of the things I want to start off with, just kind of making sure everyone has a level set on. If you're not familiar with Forrester, at our core, what we are is a research firm. Right, so we do a lot of research. One of the big pieces of research we do every year is we do a global security survey where we go out to security pros just like yourselves all over the world and ask them about their experiences. What is your experiences with breaches? How did breaches happen? What are you doing to solve those problems? So that's how I'm going to start this off. I'm going to get into a little bit of data, just kind of give us a foundation to talk about what's going on here in 2020. So let's jump into data breaches and trends. Now, if you're like me, you're waking up every day during 2020 and you're like Jean-Luc Picard. He gets on the deck of the Enterprise and the first thing he wants to know is, what happened today? Give me the damage report, right? If anyone's familiar with Star Trek The Next Generation, you know that Jean-Luc, this is typical after the Enterprise has encountered some sort of space battle or something like that with Klingons or Kardashians or what have you, or Cardassians, not Kardashians, Dacians. Very important distinction on those. So anyway, this is sort of how we all feel here in 2020, just kind of battered. And I think that's reflected in our survey results, where about half of our survey, actually over half of our survey respondents said, yes, we did have a data breach in the last 12 months. So if you're among those who experienced a data breach at your firm last year, you're in good company. Over half of our respondents said the same thing. And about a third of those said that those data breaches happened because of external actors, coming in and having an impact on the organization. About a quarter of those incidents, and we're going to touch on this later, so it's a little kind of coming attractions here. We're going to touch on insider incidents a bit in our predictions, right? So about a quarter of the data breaches in the last 12 months happened as a result of internal incidents. These are things like malicious insider or accidental insider, or something similar. Then we also had third-party breaches, about 21%. And then my favorite, lost or stolen assets, about 21%. Now, if you factor in all of the devices and things that get left behind in Ubers, airplanes, TSA bins, et cetera, I'm going to anticipate that lost or stolen asset is going to be down year over year, since no one's really traveling at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see in our next in our 2021 data anyway. All right. So what kind of data are we talking about, right? We're talking about the things that really matter. We're talking about PII. We're talking about PHI kind of data. We're talking about account numbers, all this stuff that's very valuable to attackers. What's another thing that's really valuable to attackers? Authentication credentials, right? They want our usernames and passwords. And if anyone is following password patterns, it doesn't seem like we're getting better at creating complex passwords as people. And it's kind of incumbent on us as cybersecurity pros to push for things like multi-factor authentication in our environments. So this authentication credential theft is quite a big of a deal as it is. The other thing that I always point out when I do these talks is intellectual property. And why are authentication and credentials and intellectual property sort of unique compared to this other stuff? Well, they aren't regulated, right? There are no compliance guidelines that come out and say, thou shalt protect your authentication credentials, or thou shalt protect your intellectual property. Instead of that being part of some kind of compliance regime, it actually has to be something that we protect as a matter of course as security pros. We actually need to think about our intellectual property in ways that we need to protect it. Why? Because that's the stuff that we're investing in for future revenues to keep the company alive, right? And if you follow the insider threat issue, and you follow what's happened with a lot of nation states, et cetera, intellectual property becomes a giant target. It's sort of one of those things we don't really talk about enough, I think, in security. So I just want to point that out here as a valuable data type. Now, how do these external attacks get carried out? Well, far and away, it's things like application attacks, software vulnerabilities, which we hear so much about. Millions and millions of lines of code, thousands and millions of systems, out there, internet exposed. So vulnerable software becomes, and vulnerable systems become a huge target for external actors. You can kind of see number 2 here on this list, web application attacks, very related, obviously, to software vulnerabilities. And then I mentioned before the use, authentication credentials being targeted. Now, why are those targeted? So bad guys, external actors can use those authentication credentials against us. They can actually get into our systems, get into our networks, then act like they're a user or an admin or what have you. So really think about those vulnerable systems that are internet facing and how important it is to understand what those systems are and what their risk state is. Are they vulnerable? Do we need to patch them? Do we need to take some other compensating control to protect those systems if they're not able to be patched for some reason? Now, this is kind of looking at vulnerabilities in severity over time. This is a diagram from NIST. You can kind of see a projection here for 2020, right, in the sort of the odd colored green there. Sort of the story of this, though, is the more code that we write and the more systems that we launch out into the world, the more risk and vulnerable we are as enterprises, right? As people that are creating technology and exposing that to the internet and using that for our businesses. We're putting ourselves at risk, and it becomes really incumbent on us as security pros to understand that risk, to account for that, and then design our protections such that we're not putting all of our data and systems at risk. Now, with that said, another question to me that is one of the most fascinating over the last several years from our security survey is we asked CISOs, what is your biggest security challenge? In year over year, it is complexity. It's complexity of the IT environment. It's because we're doing things like moving to hybrid cloud environments. It's because we've got all these applications and systems that we're launching. It's because suddenly we took everybody, that is typically working in an office, and we packed them up and we sent them home and said, now you shall now work remotely. So now think about the complexity of all of those systems, all of those people, and kind of the magnification of that as a security leader, right? So you've got this complexity of your IT environment internally. It's in some ways a little outside your zone of control as a security pro, because you've got developers building things, you've got other parts of the business making decisions, and then security is sort of looped in sometimes at the last moment to come in and secure the whole thing. Now you combine that with the second one on this list, right? The changing and evolving nature of IT threats, coming mostly from external actors, right? So you combine those two things. We have a really shifting and changing and constantly evolving internal environment that we're responding to and adapting our plans to. And at the same time, we have threat actors out externally that are trying to find ways to poke holes in all of our protections. It makes the job of a security pro and a security leader that much more complex. So to me, that complexity and that uncertainty and the continually evolving and changing nature of these things become really difficult for us as security pros, and something that we really have to kind of wrap our heads around and have better systems just for tracking what's going on in our environments. All right, so what everyone came here today for was cybersecurity predictions for 2021. So I don't want to disappoint. Let's jump right into predictions for 2021. Now, one thing I will say, just like Jedi Master Yoda here, it's always hard to figure out what's going to happen in the future. I think if we got in the Wayback Machine and we were sitting here in 2019 thinking ahead to what's going to happen in 2020, no one saw that the pandemic coming. No, well, maybe we started getting hints of it here in late November 2019, but no one saw that kind of impact. So anything can happen in 2021. A little sense of foreboding, I suppose, for what's coming, for coming attractions. But anyway, let's get out our very murky looking crystal ball here and see what's coming our way in 2021 from a cybersecurity standpoint. Now, we had 5 predictions, 5 cybersecurity predictions, I should say, for Forrester for 2021. Now, one of those is something that we've been following in research over the past couple of years, which is the trend away from US-centric cybersecurity startups and companies. For years, the US has been rather dominant in terms of the companies that have started here in the US and then have taken their wares, globally. So we've had a kind of a real, strong cybersecurity industry here in the US. Now, one of the things that's happened over the last several years, though, is you've got the European Commission that has looked at that and said, hey, why can't we have cybersecurity startups in Europe or in EMEA? You're starting to see some regionalization in Asia Pac saying the same thing. Why do we need to depend on US firms to defend our companies, our governments, et cetera? So you look at the investment, right, for cybersecurity companies, which was around 15 billion with a B dollars in 2019, and that's worldwide. About 4 billion of that was coming out of Europe. What we're predicting is that we're going to see a shift over that 2019 baseline, about 20%. Where we're going to see European startups being funded. We're going to see Asia Pac startups being funded. What we're going to really see is more regionalization and more choice. And I think that's actually, in some ways, a good thing for companies and governments that want to have a more regional approach. So it's something that we'll be tracking over the next couple of years from a investment standpoint. Second prediction, a CISO from a global 500 firm will be fired for instilling a toxic security culture. Now, this is something that I think people are getting very familiar with, mostly thanks to social media. It's very difficult now if you've got a company culture, no matter where you are in the world, that is toxic and your workers don't like what is going on at the company. A lot of the time, They're not going to be quiet about that anymore. We have outlets like here in the US and other places, glassdoor.com, where people can go and review their employer. And a lot of employers have really invested heavily in trying to influence what people are saying about the company externally. And there's some pretty noted examples out of 2019. My colleague Janan Budge points out one of them. And for anybody who's not in the US or doesn't have a chance to watch daytime television, I apologize for this example, but a very noted example was the Ellen DeGeneres show. And Ellen, if you don't know who Ellen is, she's a comedian turned talk show host, and she's very famous for doing wonderful things for people. And what happened was, behind the scenes, she had producers that had created this toxic culture, and they were not treating people behind the scenes all that well. And a lot of the production staff got on social media and said, hey, you would think that this would be a great place to work, and we try to do nice things for people, but we're all terrible. This is a terrible experience here. And Ellen had to come out and apologize, right? So you think about that, but what the heck does that have to do with cybersecurity? Everyone's probably wondering that right now. What that has to do with cybersecurity is we've had a tendency of cybersecurity to have this sort of hero complex in a lot of ways in cybersecurity, or cybersecurity has been seen as the department of no, the people that always say no to everything. You want to go roll out a new application, you want to go and actually use social media perhaps on your corporate network or devices, and here comes cybersecurity. No, we're not doing any of that. So one of the predictions here is that if we don't kind of transition, cybersecurity from being that department of no, or having this sort of hero culture where we tolerate toxic toxic individuals on our teams, if we don't actually start moving away from that, that's going to reflect negatively on the CISO, on the leader. So the CISO, for probably the first time, has really got to start concentrating on how do we change the image of cybersecurity? How do we make sure we're not promoting a culture of toxicity in our environment? So just something to think about, right? We've got to evolve as cybersecurity pros, just like other parts of the business. All right, so this is one that's near and dear to my heart, because insider risk and insider threat is a big part of my coverage here at Forrester. So prediction number 3 is that about a third of data breaches will be caused by insider incidents, an increase from where it is today, which is about a quarter. Now, why is that? Right, a big reason is all of the uncertainty that is going on in the world today. One of the things that causes people to become insider threat, risky insiders or malicious insiders, is because they don't feel comfortable. Maybe they work in one of those toxic workplaces, right? And they want to get back at somebody. Another reason is fear of layoff. Somebody may be sitting there, perfectly happy in their job, find out that, hey, the company's going to cut a lot of folks, maybe my job's at risk. So one of the things that insiders will do is they'll hedge their bets. They'll say, hey, I've been working on this project. Remember we talked about intellectual property theft? So think about the person that's working on the project, and they say, I worked really hard on this. I'm going to save this data down, and then when I get to my next job, I'll have a leg up. I'll have a little bit of an advantage. I'm going to take some of this project work, some of this code perhaps, or whatever I've been working on with me. Or it could be a salesperson who wants to take all of their account data with them so they can just reach out to their accounts at their next job. So it's all these kinds of things that will kind of lead to an increase of insider incident. One of the other things, quite honestly, is if you're not looking for insider incidents, chances are you're not going to find insider incidents, because insiders tend to be pretty quiet and buttoned up about their behaviors, right? They look like other users inside the environment. One of the things that's happening is, companies are spending money to go and focus on this as a threat vector. They're buying technology, they're hiring people, they're designing process around it. And so that illuminates more of this activity. So we'll see what happens, but the prediction is we'll go from about a quarter of breaches being caused by insiders to about a third in 2021. So prediction 4, retail and manufacturing will have more breaches because of a shift in the way they do business. And this is one that has been accelerated quite a bit by the pandemic. Anybody who's been paying attention for the last decade or so has heard the term digital transformation. We're going to change our business models to be more accommodating to the customer. One of the things that's happened in this this sort of post-pandemic economy is it has all accelerated. uh, you know, I don't know about all of you out there, but I have probably ordered more food to be delivered to our house than I ever have before. Normally, you just order a pizza, the pizza shows up. Now we got everything showing up, right? Same thing. I have never ordered, groceries to be delivered to my house prior to the pandemic. Now groceries show up here at the house. I can't even tell you the last time I, had to go to a store that did not sell food or booze uh, and buy something. And a lot of that is because of this, this shift. And one of the things that has happened, is that people do not want to have to go and search all over the place for whatever it is they want to buy, whether that's a consumer good or a business good. What they're what that means for retailers, what that means for manufacturers, what that means for others is they have to find new ways to reach their consumers. And what does that mean? Well, that means more consumer and internet facing systems, more consumer and internet facing applications. So we're writing more code, we're exposing that code publicly, right? Because this is how people are going to find our business, it's how they're going to buy stuff, and it's how things are going to get done. Every time we write more code and expose more systems, we introduce more risk. So one of the things we're going to find is, as a result of all that, we're going to have an increase in breaches year over year as a result of this kind of a direct to consumer sort of a shift in the expose, and this kind of additional applications to make that happen. And sort of very related is our last prediction, and that is that audit findings and budget pressure is going to lead to the uptake of risk quantification tech. Now, why does this matter? All right, so audit findings, we go in with an auditor and we find that we've got either compliance problems or we're not sufficient in the way in our security controls. Budget pressure, we solve a lot of our security problems and a lot of our compliance problems by adding people to the equation, right? Hire more people to go solve the issue. In a kind of a time of constrained budgets, however, it's really hard to go and get those people and justify having those people go and take care of these compliance problems and take care of all these audit findings, et cetera. So how do we solve for that? Well, we solve for that with technology, right? By using technology to help us quantify risk, to help us look for vulnerable assets, to help us find those internet facing assets, and then help us calculate risk. So now we can go back to the business and have a business conversation about what's going on in our environment and how we need to respond to it. So we're going to, as a result of all this, we're going to see increased investment in technology, not just people, to help us quantify and reduce risk. So that's our last of our predictions here. So just a few recommendations, right? So thinking about the regionalism, kind of the shift in where investment's going to happen with new security vendors. Pay attention to vendors in the region where you're located. If you're outside of North America, start looking for those startups that may be in your region that may be able to solve problems for you. Think about culture as part of security. We always think about technology as part of security, but think about not only the team itself, but how does the team get reflected out across all parts of the organization where you work? How is security viewed? And it's kind of imperative that we start really, especially as we want to bring in and retain people to our security teams. That means we have to learn our soft skills, and which is something that technology professionals and especially security professionals we've not always been really good at. Insider threat defense, actually give some focus to insider risk. If you don't have any focus on insider risk, chances are it's happening and you're not able to detect it. And remember that just trusting your employees and contractors and et cetera, that's not a security control. We actually have to have real legit security controls in place to prevent things like insider theft and that type of thing. So expand product security and your security champions programs to developers. And that's really all about, as we have this shift for retailers and manufacturers and others that have not typically done direct to consumer types of delivery. Think about all the new applications, all the new systems that may be now facing those customers. You really have to understand what those assets are, the state of the vulnerability of those assets, and that means really having a good asset discovery and management program, as well as understanding how attackers could come and take advantage of those. Then lastly, look for risk qualification solutions and also understand the dependencies, because you can't just have the tech without actually feeding data into the tech. So as you're kind of exploring that and trying to figure out where does that fit in your program, just understand that it's going to require that you actually feed data into those systems. So you want to be able to move past just the basic risk management sort of a business case, and now really be able to communicate what assets you have, what the vulnerability state of those assets is, and then what the risk back to the business is. Then how do you solve for that as a security pro? That's what the business wants to hear from us as security pros, not just we've got tons of vulnerabilities and we can't do anything about it. They actually want to see that we can quantify this stuff and we can build a plan to go and reduce that risk. That's what the business wants and expects. Now, to leave you on this happy note, I'm also a giant fan of the Mad Max franchise. I actually don't think that this is true, that this took place in 2021, because I originally watched The Road Warrior way back in the 80s, and it seemed very post-apocalyptic back in the 80s. But just keep in mind, we could be eating dog food out of a can here in 2021. Who knows what's around the corner? On that happy note, I'm going to hand it off to Derek, who's going to walk us through the rest of the presentation here.
Thank you, JB. I am now going to have to contend with following up after a Star Trek, Star Wars, and a Mad Max reference. So hopefully I can do you justice. Can you see my screen okay?
Yep, looks good.
Awesome. All right, let's get started. So I think for the audience and for you, JB, I think one of the key things here with what I'm going to kind of extend from your talk is looking at some of those predictions in a little bit more fine detail, especially the last three, which I thought were really fascinating. We talked about insider threats. We talked about the kind of retail side and the need to really understand attack surface area. So we're going to talk a little bit of attacker lensing and the opportunity for attackers, but also what we can do about it. Because I think both sides are important to really start to get a handle on that problem. And so there is a golden opportunity for attackers right now. If you look at, what attackers want to do, the first thing is really to recon. And I think that's kind of not really unlike what you see in the normal world. You see a lot of, even in military operations, you'll see things where they go out and do recon and they understand what the target is before you go and try to understand or exploit a weakness. Same thing happens for attackers, depending on, no matter who they are. They really want to understand what the weak points of it are of an organization, so they can go in and exploit some weaknesses to gain some impact. And they don't target just devices; they target people too. We're going to focus a little bit more on the device risk aspect today, but there's people provide phishing surfaces just because people want to click on links all the time. We all get emails; I get them on a regular basis, and sometimes it's hard to determine what is a phishing email that might be malicious versus what's real in your inbox. But there's also websites that are created by attackers sometimes to do that. So that's that people domain. On the device domain, there's a large swath of attack surface area on the internet, and it's important for companies to get a hold of all their digital assets and inventory those digital assets, the devices, domain names, certificates, so on, because those all have reputational and breach risk that impacts us as companies. And so one of the main things, though, is that we're really seeing, and some of the things that you pointed out, JB, I really like, because we're seeing an unprecedented shift right now. If you talk about, a long time ago, maybe not so long ago, I remember when, 20 years ago, let's say, IT was static. You had servers, they were racked maybe behind you, and you sat maybe in behind, right, maybe you sat directly in front of those servers and you hear them whirring. So you could actually physically point to each device and say, hey, this device, you know what it is. And so you really had a really good understanding about your inventory when it came to an IT perspective 20 years ago. As we saw kind of from this kind of shift towards virtualization in cloud environments, the first commercial hypervisor by VMware was released around 2003. By 2006, we had AWS coming online, and so on and so forth until today, where there's massive cloud providers all gaining lots of traction. And so you see this shift from traditional IT with these traditional mechanisms about how things are managed to more of this dynamic IT environment. And that's what's really fascinating and amazing. Cloud spend has risen 37% in the first quarter of 2020. And PricewaterhouseCoopers, actually a survey they did showed that some finance leaders were about looking at 75% in terms of flexibility for spending, which is a pretty staggering number. If you think about that and how uncertainty in the last year has caused a lot of that shift in thinking, it's pretty staggering because it really requires us to think about how we can be more dynamic with our IT needs. And then by some reports, 60% of us plan on increasing cloud spend. And that's also a drastic number. It's incredibly drastic considering that, we were growing in cloud spend on a pretty good steady rate prior to COVID, but post-COVID, especially after the March timeline, you see this massive shift in the rethinking of core organizations that need to be very nimble and need to be very agile. And that's a really great thing that you pointed out as well, JB. I think everything's really well interconnected. And as we kind of continue to grow, even as some things come out, for example, vaccines that maybe help us in our economy recover in a lot of places in the global scale, we're still going to have a lot of this infrastructure. We're transitioning now. We're going to have the static, regular traditional IT. We're going to have cloud environments. We're going to be hybrid. We might transition more to the cloud, but there's going to be a phase where we're all in this kind of transitionary state. So it's really important to get ahead of it. And JB, I know you had some Star Trek references, so I'm going to pull one of mine. So we see the complexity, as you mentioned, is increasing. We saw that statistic about how complexity in IT is increasing over time. But not only that, the IT decision-making process is also something that has been shifting. So, again, 20 years ago, you had more centralized IT decision-making versus today, where companies are empowering employees and everybody around them to be able to, pretty much, figure out how to be more agile for the business. And I think that's a really interesting fact in how we're all trying to operate and grapple with, the dynamism of the kind of marketplace that exists today. But this is a really kind of interesting point, is that you talked about the digital transformation, and I think that this is definitely something that we hear a lot from leaders as well. Is this concept is going to continue. This empowering of employees is going to continue. So it's important for us to get a hold of it. And one of the things that I think has been really impacting this and very, very impactful for us as organizations is this concept of citizen IT. Citizen IT is this new concept within the last 10 years or so that has been around that really allows us to empower the employees to swipe that corp card and get new infrastructure online for that agility. But attackers can really take advantage of that, right? Attackers can find the weaknesses and holes within the infrastructure that's created. If an employee creates new infrastructure, virtual card swipe, and they put it online, but that infrastructure doesn't follow the standards, the policies, and the compliance that your organization needs, that poses new risk. So it's important to be able to get a hold of that. It's also important to really see phishing attack surfaces. We'll talk about that in a little bit more couple slides later, but it's incredibly important because attackers might also be creating environments that look like yours to trick either your employees or your customers into doing things like potentially yielding PII or stealing credentials that they could use against you at some later point. So it's really important to kind of get ahead of that and really understand what the landscape looks like. Census, I'm CTO at Census. You probably saw that from the beginning of the slide, but Census has been around since 2013. We've been around since 2017, but since 2013, a core piece of our technology ZMAP, that the company was founded on, really has been iterating on being better at understanding the entire internet. And so we've been collecting a lot of this information more recently and assembling it into views. And we'll talk about that a tiny bit later. The last note I want to talk about too is that insider threat that you talked about, JV. That prediction. I think that's incredibly important. We saw just what was it, last year, I think, where there was an insider at a cloud company. I'm not going to name names here, but that had information on a financial services customer, and a lot of that information ended up being exposed. And so, it's not just malicious insiders that may use that information later against you or your customers, but it also might be accidental insider release of information, where maybe an insider had unknown, like maybe unauthorized access to something that they didn't really know about, and then maybe that was breached from some other mechanism. So people internally, we're all responsible for playing part of the security ecosystem. Now, let's just talk a little bit more about what attackers would be looking at. And so this is just one very small, narrow slice of it, but we're going to focus a little bit on AWS right now. It's not to pick on AWS, but more so because AWS provides services that we use. So these aren't issues with AWS. These are issues with how we utilize these cloud services. But if you take a look at this graph right here, this is a graph of SMB port exposure over time. And you can see that pretty much steadily rising up and to the right. And what's really interesting about this is, if you're not familiar with SMB, it's server message block. It's a protocol that allows for sharing files. SMB really has no reason to be on the internet. There's no good reason for us to expose SMB on the internet. There's better file sharing mechanisms. There's cloud-based file sharing mechanisms that fit better within a zero trust framework model. But SMB is also well known for its history of vulnerability. So we've seen, I think it was back in 2008 with Configure, we've seen WannaCry, we've seen NotPetya come up. These are all issues that stemmed from the availability of SMB and the ability for SMB to be exploited. SMB is a protocol that's been around for some time, but if you look at this graph, it's really interesting. And you'll see this on a couple graphs coming up, is this pivot where around the May-June timeframe, it starts to take off on an upward trend. And so, we really need to make sure that as we're looking at traditional IT services, which SMB I would say falls into, and going to more cloud environment, that we understand the weaknesses, and we understand where configuration mistakes can be made so we can address them. Here's just an example, though. It's a little bit different than the last graph we saw, because you see something that's more of a flat trend line. And this is SSH. So a secure shell, which is basically administration protocol for us to be able to terminal into a server and administer it. Port 22 is generally what you see it on, but it remains fairly flat. And that's, that could be good, that could be bad. But the interesting thing about this, whether it's good or bad in terms of whether it's rising, there's still a significant amount of them. And on top of there being a significant amount of them, we saw earlier from some statistics that you said, JB, plus we'll see in a second as well from some Verizon DDIR statistics that a lot of credential stuffings happen all the time. The second you get a new service online on the internet, it will be contacted. You're going to get unsolicited traffic, and there's lots of bots and scanners out there that just want to continuously attack it and try to test credentials to see if they can get in. So there's no really good reason to expose SSH unless you really need to. So just something to keep in mind as what attackers will look for. And then just one last look, take a look at RDP. So RDP stands for Remote Desktop Protocol. This was something as part of the Microsoft Terminal Services package that came out a long time ago. It allows you to remotely administer a Windows computer by basically getting a virtual desktop to it, an image you can see on your screen, and you can control it remotely. So this runs on port 3389, and this graph shows us kind of the rate of increase over time. And you see this like little inflection point on the May around June timeframe where things start to then tick up slowly up and to the right. And it's really fascinating because you might have heard of RDP being involved in this thing called Bluekeep, because there was a vulnerability that came out. There was a Bluekeep exploit that exploited that vulnerability, and this allowed for remote code execution. And so these types of protocols, although they may be part of our traditional program for managing IT, they shouldn't be exposed to the internet, and we should be thinking about that as we transition more of these resources to a cloud, because attackers absolutely are looking at these things on a regular basis. Let's take a look, though, at what Verizon has to say. So I'm going to call back again to you, JB, because I thought what was interesting is the survey results of what we see as organizations, and what we are kind of experiencing, and then from the outside view of Verizon and what they saw from their measurement of breach responses is really kind of interesting because there's a lot of overlap here. And I would just say, if you're looking at this graph, focus on the top two sections. I'm kind of going through this for a second, but a significant number of breaches here happened from hacking. And I think we'll dig into a little bit more of what that means, but this is kind of significant because hacking can be a wide category, but it tells us that part of what we need to really do is understand an attack surface area, because they will absolutely, attackers are absolutely looking to just interact with those devices and try to see if they can break into them. And I think the second most interesting category is this misconfiguration category. And misconfiguration and the DBIR, they break it down into kind of two different avenues, really. There's things like misdelivery, where you maybe accidentally send an email and you get and to somebody that you didn't intend to, and so there's some data loss that way, maybe some sensitive information. And there's also the misconfiguration of just IT assets. Maybe you expose something online, maybe you added that RDP port to that service and you put it on the internet and you didn't intend to. So that misconfiguration category is factoring into what Verizon's even saying from the breach reports perspective. Web applications are yet another category. So we see 43% of web applications being involved in breaches. Coming back to that note earlier about credential stuffing, 37% of breaches included credential stuffing, and then 22% involved in phishing. So phishing just isn't about the people. Phishing is also about attackers creating infrastructure to attack people, to basically trick them into thinking that it's yours. So the more you can understand on not only what your surface area is, but if other attackers are creating surface area that looks like yours in order to trick your customers or your employees, I think that's incredibly important. That factors into some of what we're seeing in the global scale. Lastly, I know a lot of noise, two graphs here, but let's just take a look at the top sections of both of these graphs really quick. And let's dig into a little bit about that hacking category that I just called back to a second ago. 80% of the breaches involve brute force. So we talked about credential stuffing, brute force. So that's where you just essentially iterate and you're trying to test new credentials, versus credential stuffing might just take credentials from an existing source. Maybe it was a breach event that happened and they shoved those credentials in. 80% of the hacking occurred from just brute forcing credentials in. Remote administration, that was another target. So we talked about that with the reason why we had those graphs up. But Telnet was also not in there, but we also see this one a lot. RDP and SSH, those are all table stakes for bot-based attacks, for human-based interactive attacks. But kind of what the interesting thing is to me in this breach report, and if you kind of read the further details in the report, it's only about 5% of the hacking attempts actually exploited some type of vulnerability. So that's interesting, because you could probably think back to recent history where a vulnerability, like for example, Struts was exploited for very large impact on an organization, and yet we're only seeing about 5% of that on the regular be the real impacting event. Now, sometimes that can, even though it's 5%, that can still have a very massive impact. So we can't lose sight of tracking and remediating vulnerabilities, but it's interesting in that it factors so little into what we're seeing from an outside perspective on breach investigations. So really what we need to do is start to kind of get a hold of all this, is start to really understand and track our own inventory. How do we get a list of our own assets? And assets for security teams aren't necessarily the same thing as IT teams. Assets could be domains, they can be certificates, they can be websites, they can be devices. There's plenty of things that we can consider to be assets, because all of these things to us have a reputational or risk inleave into our organization. So it's incredibly important for us to get this kind of locked down. And traditional methods and traditional tools like asset management products and maybe VA products, they don't do as much as you really may need. You may need actually being able to scan. So VA products may be able to provide you with information on things about, but what about the things you don't know about? What about those phishing surface area that has been created by some attacker trying to emulate maybe an SSO login for your company? What about that extra infrastructure that was brought online by an employee? So a lot of these tools don't quite fit the need today, and it's important for creating a holistic inventory so you can get a really good view and start to remediate some of these issues. And more on that a little bit. You could stitch together some of this, I think, right? There's some tools that are available out there, such as Recon NG and Amass, and these are open source tools. These will require you to have teams to kind of do the work to stitch them all together and integrate them in a meaningful way back into your environment. So it's really about the amount of effort and for me, hacking and preventing hacking. I've been in the security industry for about over 15 years now, but preventing hacking for me is really just raising the cost of hacking. And so if we can raise the cost and get ahead of that, it's really a game of opportunity and playing to how we can ensure that we can make more work for the attacker. And that's a key part of it. And so investigating and validating the results is a key part of what we do. And having these solutions, having a really core solution that integrates that work, reduces our team load so that our team can focus more on the remediation side and less on the kind of hunting side. That's incredibly important. What we really see, though, is this kind of 4-step process. So this aspect of discovery. How can you find all the things that belong to you? We talked about inventory. Now we need to understand and record them. We need to understand their life cycle, how they plug into our downstream tooling. Maybe that's when you actually integrate a VA scanner, so you can do a closed loop and actually scan it for more intelligent vulnerabilities. You need to prioritize it. JB, you talked about risk earlier. Prioritization is a key aspect of any security program. What do you need to do first? What do we need to do first to reduce, and what can we do to impact the most amount of risk reduction, rather than being able to just kind of go in and figure it out for ourselves. Prioritization, remediation, risk, it's all incredibly important. And then lastly, yeah, we need to integrate it with downstream tools. We need to create tickets. We need to be able to create closed loops so that we can address a lot of this infrastructure. So just a little bit more on that. We got the discover piece. You need to hunt for your assets. Maybe you use like a search tool. There's a lot of internet search engines. Census has one. You can go to our website, and we have a little slide for the end of that, but you can go to our website. You can hunt for your own infrastructure. You can manually import it into your inventory, or you can leave it to us, and we'll talk about that at the end too. You need to record your inventory. You need to manage it. We talked about doing that with inventory tools. We talked about VA scanners and how they could play a role in this too. You need to be able to prioritize which issues need to be done first, because those will have the most impact on your risk. And you need to find the ones that maybe you have vulnerabilities and misconfiguration. As we're moving to the cloud, we're going to find a lot more misconfiguration. It's just human nature as we transition from this old thinking of traditional IT into the new cloud infrastructure way of thinking. There's just differences in how you do that and different tooling that to be able to support it, like security groups and VPCs and those types of containering concepts. We need to understand how this comes back to our entire ecosystem, creating tickets using downstream sort tools. We talked about all that. We need to gain that intuition on whether we're improving and with whether or not we have robust reporting. If I was a CISO, how are we doing over time? Is our attack surface increasing or decreasing? What are we doing about it? Are we coming in and out of compliance? How often is that happening? Those are the types of questions we need to be able to answer. And so let's actually talk a little bit about my predictions, JB, because I thought yours were fascinating. So I'm going to give a little bit of crack too, to see if I can actually throw my hat in the ring here. First, I don't have gray hair yet, but I think I'm going to get some gray hair. I get some maybe on my face when I don't shave, and I get a little bit straggly after a while. But I think I'm going to get gray hair. But to the real predictions, one high profile breach event is going to happen related to public facing footprint. We've already seen this happen in the past. We know it's going to happen again. This is a big RIP transition right now that happened this year for folks moving to cloud environments. So one of my predictions is that this is going to be an issue that's going to impact all of us. The second prediction is I think that misconfigurations and errors are going to be at least as high or even higher than most breach reports that we're going to continue to see. These are going to likely be due to cloud configuration mistakes. And so I think it's really important for us to really focus on our cloud attack surface as well. And then lastly, we've seen this trend of protocols such as DNS and SMB being wrapped into new protocols that enable some things. So SMB actually, maybe you don't know, but SMB has been by a lot of ISPs filtered out because of the fact that it's so wormable. Now there's some talk about actually wrapping that into another protocol called QUIC. It's used currently with to optimize websites. It was created by Google, I think. But now QUIC is also being talked about to wrap SMB so you can still access it, But the thing is, it's bypassing some of the ISP filtering controls, but now it just reopens that whole port. And now the telemetry that we've already created and the tooling in the last 20 years has no idea how to detect that, because now you have to unwrap the protocol a little bit more. And a lot of times it's encrypted. You can't actually see it. So a lot of the tools we have around telemetry collection for encrypted protocols are going to change. A lot of the NTA tools that we have and the packet DPI, the deep packet inspection tools that we have, those are no longer going to be able to have visibility into these protocols. So it's going to be incredibly important for us to identify them and to mitigate the impact that they may have on our security program. So that being said, that kind of wraps up my predictions. That wraps up kind of our thoughts. Wanted to say thank you, JB, for joining me today. If you at all are interested, those who are listening right now, in kind of understanding a little bit more about the attack surface and what it means for you, please feel free to reach out to us. You can go to our website, census.io/demo request. You can start hunting for your own infrastructure right now at census.io/IPv4. If you have additional questions outside of this webinar today, feel free to reach out to us at hello@census.io. But that kind of wraps things up. And now we'll kind of poke around and see if we can take any questions from the audience, if there were any dropped in. Let's see. So we got one question that comes in here from, I'm hoping I'm not going to butcher this, Konstantinos, asking, what about honeypots and their protection? So if you could give me a little bit more color around that, I can talk a little bit about honeypots. So if you mean essentially, honeypots in terms of whether or not people are using that information to understand whether or not their their surface area, their assets or devices are actually doing malicious things on the internet, that's an important distinction as well. I think that there are some companies that actually do this today. And honeypots can provide us with a rich set of information with respect to whether or not our infrastructure is emitting weird signals. If you have some infrastructure on AWS that's hitting a honeypot, that gives you some telemetry of whether or not that AWS asset, maybe for example, is doing something malicious that you didn't intend it to do. In reality, what I've seen, so for my background, I have a deep background in internet scanning. I have a deep background in LAN scanning and honeypotting. And so I can speak to this and say that one of the aspects to that's kind of slightly interesting is that you tend to see low quantity, high quality signal from that interaction. So I wouldn't expect to see that on the regular. If you have other controls on the asset, especially maybe some type of agent, like an EDR agent or something that you may have rolled into your AWS device, I think that would provide a better level of protection. But honeypots can provide you with some type of behavioral analysis if they give you some level of indication whether or not your device is doing something malicious. So hopefully that answered your question. If not, please feel free to clarify in the Q&A, and I'll definitely try to hit you up. Or if you have more that you'd like to talk about, feel free to shoot it at hello@census.io and take a look when it comes in. Okay, we got a follow-up. So I think we have to set up more honeypots in order to analyze new threats. Yeah, so you can. I think if you're talking about on LAN honeypots, and I think that is a lot of tools do this today. There are products in the marketplace that provide you with the ability to do this. That online honeypots can tell you whether or not there's a malicious actor within your network that's trying to identify and potentially pivot from devices within the network. I think, again, that's where some endpoint tools come into play. I think having that telemetry being collected from your assets is probably a little bit more reasonable. Those devices tend to be honeypots on LAN, and I'll talk about the internet side again in a sec, but honeypots on LAN tend to be very much more noisy, especially if you have a more robust security program where your own internal scanning tools, maybe you have a VA product already in place, are doing large ping sweeps of the entire network. And if your security team hasn't maybe black holed those devices or blacklisted them or deny listed them from your environment, that'll be important. We're getting more. So here, yes, on each organization, especially on industrial environments, must be recommended. Yes, I totally agree. Yeah, for industrial control environments, those can be very beneficial because industrial control environments, you can't actually install endpoint agents. A lot of those devices end up being very locked down by the vendors that deploy those industrial controls. But I would look more from an industrial perspective on how your public surface area, what's your public surface area? Maybe you have remote control capabilities. Hopefully not, but maybe there are some. And identifying where those are important. Maybe there are phishing surfaces. So someone may be trying to identify your, create a kind of trick for some of your employees to get some credentials, eventually log into some of these systems for administration. Those are the things that I think are probably slightly more valuable in that context. And then the honeypots can be a little bit more information driven. I agree, they can give you a little bit more telemetry inside. If there's a lot of malicious traffic, you can kind of marry those signals together and get a better sense of them.
Yeah, and Derek, and I think a lot of the industrial control environment specifically too, anything that's listening passively like that and exposing those connected assets, becomes extremely valuable for all the reasons you just said. It can actually be difficult to have controls on the device itself, so it ends up becoming much more about controlling access to the asset.
Absolutely agree. And Konstantinos also added, for payment issues, we must create a verify by touch service with biometric authentication in order to cross check. Yeah, it's a very good point. And I think that, I think there's a lot of things we can do on the retail side too. So these are definitely great points and questions.
Yep.
Who wants to clarify attacks with payloads? Thanks for the engagements, by the way, Konstantinos.
Absolutely.
Anybody else, by the way, as well, have any questions, feel free to shoot them on.
Hey, Derek, I think I've already beat you for the gray hair, though. I don't know if 2021 is going to make the rest of this go gray, but the sides of this are already done, man. I'm just happy that it's still there. It's at this stage.
Yeah, you're telling me. I think I'm going to start losing some before it goes gray. Honestly,
I think the next prediction is, whatever happens next is going to cause like hair just to fall out.
yeah, no, yeah. If it's not pulled out, it turns gray. All right. These are great questions. Thanks for some of the Q&A. Again, if you have any additional questions, feel free to shoot them our way. We would love to engage. I love the questions. Keep them coming. Otherwise, thank you all for joining. I'm glad you could spend some time with JB and I on this talk today. So take care.
Thank you.